Hi, I'm Stan Tarrant. For decades, the fishing industry used traps to harvest salmon in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. Now let's take a look at the history of fish traps. The Aboriginal people who dwelt along the Pacific Rim depended on salmon for food and trade. From Honshu Island in Japan to central California, the people celebrated the return of the salmon each year. They treated the first fish with great ceremony and respect, so that his spirit would advise his brothers and sisters to return as well. Throughout what is now Alaska and the west coast of North America, native people harvested these returning salmon. They used dip nets, spears, and primitive weirs or traps made by placing branches or stones across the stream bed. In Puget Sound, they used reef nets, which consisted of pairs of canoes with small nets suspended between them. The reef fishermen cut channels through the kelp to guide the fish into the nets and erected small towers from which they could spot their prey. White settlers observed the native fishing methods. Beginning in the 1880s, the experiment with the pile trap was the outgrowth of white man's methods applied to Indian experience. Techniques for building traps came from Scandinavia, from New England, and from the Canadian Maritimes, where traps or pound nets had been used for generations in the cod, herring, and salmon harvests. In Puget Sound, pile trap technology reached its zenith. Later, when Washington voters outlawed trap fishing in state waters, Puget Sound trap men and their fishing style migrated to Alaska. From southeast to western Alaska, trap fishing endured until the passage of statehood in 1958. Each trap relied on a long line of piling called the lead that extended outward from the shoreline. The pilings supported a fence of trap wire that blocked the path of the salmon. The trap itself lay to seaward. Alaska trapman Fred Gunderson gives us a fisheye view.
Well, as he come up around and go around shore, and the first thing he hit would be the lead. Well, he's not going to swim ashore, so he'll try to go around it. Well, the trap is on the outside end of it.
Old-timers say there were over 400 trap locations claimed on Puget Sound, although many were fished only during the big years when fish were abundant. Carl Goodbranson is among the last of the Puget Sound trap fishermen. Today, he maintains the pile trap model at the Semiahmoo Museum and schools tourists in the art of trap fishing.
This particular trap is a pile trap. It fishes on the flood only. And we must assume that these fish are going to the Fraser River, and we must assume that the river is in that direction, the tide is coming in this direction, and they're built directly across that tide. The fish, when they hit the lead, could go, basically, they could go either way. They could go, if they go this way, the idea of this hook is to throw them back into the lead again where they were before. Now they're turned the other way, and they'll move up the lead quite slowly, searching all the time for an opening. When they get up to about this part, usually they'll start to spook, and they will head out this way. That's the idea of this, which is called a jigger. When they hit that, they'll follow the jigger all the way around, and when they get to the end of it, they're back where they were before. And eventually, they're going to see this 14-foot opening, and they're going to go in through it. On the next flood, they will be all against this wall because the tide is running this way. They are bucking into the tide. And they go into this tunnel. This is 4 inches across. And then they'll be in this pillar. This is the final resting place for them anyway, and this is where all the brailing takes place and where the fish end up. Now this 4 inches seemed like awful small, but the big skates can even go through this one. So the salmon had no trouble with it, even the biggest kings and whatever.
Every fourth year there occurred what was known among cannery men as a big year, with catches far above the average. Experience taught them when to expect these heavy runs and when to prepare their trap sites and processing plants for maximum production. By the big year of 1901, most of the prime trap locations had been purchased by a handful of large fishing companies. The largest was the Salmon Cartel, the Alaska Packers Association, with dozens of trap sites and canneries at Blaine, Point Roberts, and Anacortes. Later, the Pacific American Fisheries Corporation, or PAF, of Bellingham would become an even bigger canner and trap operator, and there were numerous smaller companies engaged in packing salmon. The companies fished all of their trap sites in the big years, then shut down marginal locations when fishing was lean. To protect their idle locations, they conceived the dummy trap. Goodbranson explains.
If one abandoned a trap site, if you didn't at least put one in every 7 years after that, you would lose your location. And so that's when they got on the idea of putting in the dummy trap, which was a phony from way back, but it was a law. And so they put in a makeshift spiller and a small heart and a tiny lead and a few piling and no jigger. When they couldn't catch that one fish and time was running out, they came to the trap I was on out at Birch Point with a wash tub one day. They filled that wash tub with seawater and packed it away, and they didn't say anything to anybody. It was kind of all secret. But my brother was on the lifting crew, and he told me later that they had gone to the other location, dumped the fish into the spiller, and then they all went and lifted the trap, took their one fish, and they were legal for 7 more years.
Many of the early settlers in the Puget Sound region augmented their meager farm incomes by working for the fish trap owners. Trap men worked on the pile driver crews, boat crews, or wire crews. Others worked as machinists, carpenters, blacksmiths, and the like. Women and children also found work in the canneries, usually as employees of the Chinese contractors who supplied the processing labor. Mike Goodman grew up near the canneries at Point Roberts. He started working for the China contractor at age 10.
Well, the Chinese needed fish, and I was right there always around the cannery doing something. So this one Chinaman took me and says, go to work. And I went to work, and from then on, that's what I did. The time was kept, our time that we worked was kept by the Chinese, and everything was absolutely correct at all times, as far as I was concerned. They took me and gave me food and let me eat with them in the China house, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed being with these people because they were all, every one of them, as far as I was concerned, were a gentleman, the Chinese.
Later, he worked on the wire crew.
I worked right from the start, undoing the wire and cutting it up to where it needs. I knew just exactly from dealing with these traps how we should make the wire so we can take it out and drop it and build this huge fence. And that's what we did. And we put these 6 foot wide, 200 feet long, some of them, the wire, and we fastened them together with what they call a hog ring. And we get the 2 layers of wire and fasten them by just clamping these 2 together. Big, huge rolls of wire. It takes 7, 8 men to roll them.
Like all trapmen, Goodman had a high opinion of this method of fishing.
The fish traps were the very finest way of catching fish. They came out into the boats free of any hooks or scratches or anything. They were just absolutely perfect because they swam right into the boats, as you might say, without any operation or any problems of shooting or killing or so forth. And that's one reason that the fish trap cannery had the finest fish there could be had any place.
Although processors praised the traps for their efficiency and claimed that hundreds of jobs would be lost if the traps were eliminated, fishermen hated them because they gave the canners an exclusive right to fish important areas. Traps were expensive to install and operate, and ownership was consolidated in the hands of a few corporations. Opposition mounted until trap owners had to confront a new problem: piracy. Independent fishermen discovered that you didn't have to own a trap to brail trap fish in the dark of night. In coastal communities, the trap pirates were initially viewed somewhat like Robin Hoods, who robbed from the rich for the sake of the poor. Early day trap robbery was not considered too malicious. Although some cannerymen were quick to invoke sanctions, most were reluctant to do anything about the situation, and the robbers felt they were taking only fish that unfair competition had deprived them of. If trap robbing once bordered on sport, it became a shooting war after World War I, and trap owners resorted to placing armed watchmen aboard their traps. Goodbranson signed on as a watchman in his early 20s.
Basically, this was the type of a fishing shack, a trap shack that we lived in. Some of them were on traps where they had a night watchman and a day watchman, and they were just tiny little shacks. But this kind of a house was one for 2 watchmen. And once you got out there, which would usually be in the tail end of June, you wouldn't see land again until maybe the middle of September. So it was a long, dragged out thing, especially when I was 21 and I got on APA Trap 12 in Boundary Bay with my partner was 3 times my age, you know, and kid at 21, well, that's kind of hard to spend the next 3 months with, but that's what had to take place. There was, I don't know exactly how big these were, but here's the stovepipe, and there was a stove was right in this corner, a tiny table here. One bunk went this way, and the other bunk went in this way, and there was room to walk between, but that's about all it was. But we lived out there and got by. I don't know, it wasn't easy, but I spent a lot of time rowing around and cleaning the lead and stuff like that, and you kind of had to make yourself busy. So that's about what it was. We burned coal in the stove, and they delivered the coal to us, and that was the life of a watchman.
After a few encounters with the pirates, the young fisherman acquired a dramatic means of discouraging further visits.
The gun was a 45-90 lever-action Winchester. And probably the one used to kill the buffalo. It was that old enough to be anyway. He would throw a fearsome chunk of lead into the night, though, if there's any fish pirates came around. This fellow that I watched trap with, he was afraid of fish pirates, and when he'd hear somebody, well, he'd say, "Carl, somebody out there, go out and chase them away." He'd pull the covers over his head and go back to sleep again. But I finally got onto a scheme, and I would go out and talk to him and never let him up the ladder. I'd go up and talk to him, and I'd say, "Boy, we got a bad one inside there. He's terrible temper. I don't want to wake him up. For God, don't make any noise," and so on. And they'd move, usually. They didn't want to face that fearsome man in the bunk.
During the heyday of Puget Sound trap fishing, the salmon industry depended on sockeye, or red salmon, from Canada's Fraser River. In 1917, the fish run suddenly declined, with disastrous consequences for fishermen. Marine biologists soon discovered the problem. A rock side at Hell's Gate Canyon 4 years previous had created water conditions so turbulent that few fish could reach their spawning grounds. The collapse of the sockeye runs became apparent in 1917, as dramatically fewer fish returned from the sea to spawn. Later, the U.S. and Canadian governments would restore the salmon runs by creating a fish ladder through the Hell's Gate blockage, but that couldn't save the fish traps of Puget Sound. The declining resource and the Great Depression combined to drive the Puget Sound salmon industry to its knees. For the trap men, the knockout blow was delivered by the passage of Initiative 77 in 1934, which outlawed virtually all forms of fixed gear. Only the reef net was spared. Helge Thorderson was a reef net fisherman more than 50 years ago.
Fish generally came in schools. It's kind of strange how they, like king salmon or springs, they called them up there, were 40, 50 pounders, and we would get 50 cents a piece for the white ones and $1 a piece for the red ones. And they were pretty wiry fish, and it usually took a sockeye or a humpy to lead them in. And they would follow the humpies or the sockeyes. Spring salmon traveling by themselves are kind of wiry and kind of hard to catch. Just a shadow from a man on the perch would scare them, and they'd be gone. That'd be the last you'd see of them. So it was fun just watching for salmon.
With the demise of the Puget Sound trap industry, the trap men headed for Alaska, where traps endured until the passage of statehood in 1958. To fish the deep waters of the southeastern Alaska Panhandle, where piles couldn't be driven all the way to the seabed, the trap men devised floating traps. Floating traps were constructed on the beach, then towed to the fishing location. Each trap had to be precisely surveyed, then installed with its lead oriented across the currents that carried the fish. Position the trap even slightly off the mark, and it wasn't likely to catch many fish. Gunderson understood the problem.
We had one trap at Lucky Cove when I was at Fidalgo. She would drag anchor, and we had finally ended up with put 3 5-ton anchors on the head side when the storm would come. That trap could drag 50 feet, and she'd quit the fishing. So they have to be right.
While the floating trap predominated in southeast Alaska, the Puget Sound pile trap persisted in central and western Alaska.
As far as fishing is concerned, why, for long and big fishing, those piling traps could be the floater, hands down. And when I worked with Fidalgo, I happened to look through their books one time, and the King's Mill trap caught 700,000 fish that year.
The Alaska traps were productive, but there were unique hazards, like icebergs. Phil Haston followed the traps to southeast Alaska.
The icebergs come out of Glacier Bay, you know, and you ain't stopping them. They got into the lead, ran into the lead. Well, the anchor's cables was good enough and anchored to the shore that held them, so the icebergs sit there and raise the lead up in the air. So anyhow, you had to wait till the tide changed and it melted a little bit. Good thing it didn't turn over, because every once in a while them jokers will turn over.
Yet another form of fixed gear in Alaska was the hand trap. Because these traps required extensive tide flats at low water, they were especially well suited for Cook Inlet. Once called Alaska's fish czar, former State Senate President Clem Tillon worked on the Cook Inlet hand traps.
I was a young man with a dory. I'd been fishing halibut out during that season, but then Oscar Dyson, my skipper, went for salmon, and I was left looking for a job, and Squeaky Anderson offered me one on a fish trap that he'd contracted with Athabascan village of Tyonek to put in. It was all administered by old Chief Chickalushan, who ran the village somewhat in a dictatorial manner, to the village's benefit, I might say. So I went up there, and I was on a hand trap, which is different from the other ones you'll see in this program, in that the stakes were driven by hand, the poles were stood up by hand, and the guy lines that held it were guyed each way. Other than that, it worked basically the same as the other traps, except that it had to be put in at low water and only in Cook Inlet, where they used extensively.
Like most Alaskans, Tilian was troubled by the traps.
Many of the canned salmon people said "our fish" when they spoke, and the Alaskans actually considered that these people were the owners of the fish. Therefore, they had no hesitancy about treating them much the way the Irish would treat English-owned property before the breakup. They robbed the streams, they stole anything they could, they robbed the traps, and it was considered a patriotic duty. If you fought the canned salmon industry, you were showing that you were an Alaskan. And so the hatred of the traps was not just so much the fact that they were taking too much, which could have been controlled, but that they were owned and operated by people that did not live in the territory, and they left nothing behind except their debris. And so, you know, we have now built the salmon runs of Alaska back to the largest they've been since we purchased it from Russia in 1867. And it was a mental changeover. The day we became a state and had management of fisheries, even the Constitutional Convention gave the management biologists powers that no other state in the United States gave to theirs. When we want to shut an area down, we just flat shut it down, and we don't talk about buying fishermen out or buying lodges out. The fish come first. And the Alaskans were very proud of this, and so it switched at statehood and the outgoing of the traps almost from we're stealing their fish and that's our patriotic duty to these are our fish, and anybody that goes up a creek or takes one illegal is ostracized by the other fishermen. Traps are unacceptable in Alaska today, not because they are not a good method of harvesting a resource, but because they were the symbol of a colonial empire.
Gunderson, the former trap man, agrees that ownership was the problem.
There's nothing wrong with the fish traps, it's just the people who own them. And that was the whole thing in a nutshell. The wrong people owned them.
As in Puget Sound, piracy in Alaska was once a common practice that could be deadly. Mike Goodman saw the result.
I had a cruiser, and we went up to this trap to see what the fishing was like. Stop and talk to the gentleman and see how good the fishing was. And when I got there, I couldn't see no man. There was no man on the trap. His boat was there, and his cap was laying on the little porch out in front of his shack. And I looked around, I hollered and knocked on the door, opened it up, and the man was gone. So I called the company that owned this trap, and I says, I'm here alongside of your trap, and I says, there's no man aboard. So they says, it can't be, he must be someplace. And I says, well, all right, he is, but this is the story, you know. So they asked me to stay there for a while, and I did, and they brought in a plane, and sure enough, somebody had lifted all the fish out of the trap and killed the guy.
Gunderson and his brother watched the family traps.
If you were like my brother, you couldn't have a better job than that. He used to stand by the pot tunnel, and when they come up and they'd get in, and of course then they'd circle quick and go back. So he'd stand there with a rope on the tunnel sticks and see the puppies go up and their little white faces come up there, Well, he would jerk this rope and drop the tunnel back on one side, and so they would pour in the pot.
The Gunnarsons had their share of visits from the night buyers.
We was laying alongside a trap one time, and the fellow come up and he says, "Well, how about selling some fish?" And they says, "Well, no, how much paying for them?" "Oh, I don't know, $5 a thousand or something like that." And we told him, "Well, gee, Cannery pays us a lot more than that." And he says, "Oh."
According to Tillian, trap piracy sometimes led to respectability.
Some of the big tycoons in the fishing industry today definitely got their start in what you might call illegal manners. Remember, robbing fish traps was almost a patriotic duty of an Alaskan if he could get away with it.
When the season was over, the trapped men came back to civilization. After long months of isolation, they often sought a release. Phil Haston remembers.
Oh, well, I can tell you stories about them buggers that used to get drunk, too. Jesus. Got back to catch a can one time. They had 6 months, never get nothing. And them Semiahmoos were really dry. So he goes up telling some of us young buggers was only in their teens or early 20s, and them old buggers, they were really dry. Oh, man. So come down, this one guy, he worked on the gear scow crew in the spring of the year building them floating traps. And then they used them for trap watchmen or something in the summertime, you know. So anyhow, he was ahead of us. We pulled up there in the taxi cab, a bunch of us got out, and he'd come down by himself in his taxi cab, and he had a checkered coat on. Never forget that. Well, us kids was running and catching up, and we caught up with him. He goes down the ladder, and he looks up to see who was coming. Jesus. He backed right over. Overboard he went. And down he went. Jesus, me and another kid, we tore down there quick and jerked him out. As soon as we got him on the dock, he said, "Son, never gone, I lost me whiskey." Well, what the hell, there was plenty of whiskey. We anchored up behind Mary Island, and I had to take the tender out there the next morning, because that was the only, me and the engineer were the only sober buggers aboard. Yo, son, never gone, I lost my whiskey.
The salmon trap era marked a unique period in the histories of the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. The traps are gone now, but the memory of this remarkable fishing style lives on.